Behold the Colosseum, a lasting symbol of Rome's grandeur, opulence, and spectacle. This nearly 2,000-year-old entertainment venue is a true feat of Roman engineering. Would you be surprised to know that the bulk of the manpower used to construct this grand amphitheater was actually slaves? More specifically, Jewish prisoners of war overseen by Roman engineers and craftsmen. Emperor Vespasian initiated the Colosseum's construction in the year 72, just 2 years after Jerusalem's capitulation. It was completed under his son Titus in the year 80, and his fourth story was added by his brother Domitian in the year 82. As acknowledged in the previous video in the series concerning the Arch of Titus, which was completed in 81, both the Arch and the Colosseum are not only lasting monuments of the Flavians' imperial authority and ability to draw in copious amounts of resources and specialists from across the empire, but they're also a commemoration of Roman resolve and triumph over a deadly foe. Let's go back to our story of the showdown between Rome's wrath and Judea's defiance. The year 70 saw ancient Jerusalem awash with blood. Famine, civil war, and looting had engulfed the once jewel of the Levant in chaos and despair. Not to mention the 60,000 Roman soldiers surrounding the city, choking it off from supplies and reinforcements. Nothing in, nothing out. But the defenders, the Judean rebel factions, assassins, and zealots, will not go down without a fight. They will make every Roman attacker earn their way through the city in blood. This video will cover the climax of Judea's apocalypse. The commander of the Roman forces was Titus of the Flavian dynasty. His father Vespasian had just won his bid to become emperor following his successes in Rome's first civil war since it had become an empire. Although Vespasian had commanded Roman forces during the first phase of Judea's conquest, he left the task of Jerusalem to his capable son Titus, while he himself worked on establishing his new rule in Rome. Under Titus's command were 4 legions: Legio 5 Macedonia, Legio 10 Fretensis, Legio 12 Fulminata, and Legio 15 Apollinaris, all of which totaling some 60,000 legionaries with 12,000 support personnel. Roman historian Tacitus claims that there were 600,000 Jewish inhabitants and refugees trapped in Jerusalem, several of whom were pilgrims there to celebrate Passover. Roman soldiers employed sophisticated siege engines and breaching tactics, including a high wall with ramparts and deep trenches encircling the city, as well as battering rams, siege towers, catapults, and ballistae to weaken the city's impenetrable defenses. Roman military superiority, experience, and discipline were key factors in their ability to overcome any fortification, even mighty Jerusalem's. To make matters worse for the inhabitants, the zealots began burning food supplies to entice the people to keep fighting and to not negotiate with the Romans. This action, of course, led to more suffering of the city dwellers, causing mass starvation. The dead littered the streets. These calamities played into the hands of the Romans. But Jerusalem was still heavily fortified, with some 3 protective walls and numerous citadels, such as the Temple Mount, Herod's Palace, and the Antonia Fortress, named after Mark Antony. And even more daunting for Rome, these structures were garrisoned by die-hard warriors who would fight to the last man. In this battle, these freedom fighters and fanatics would put their reputation of zealotry to the test. Titus allowed Josephus to negotiate with the defenders, but the zealots rejected any terms Rome offered. Any moderate faction within Jerusalem by this point had either been killed or coerced into silence. The assault begins. Titus launched his initial attacks against the outer city and saw gradual success. But as his forces came against the Antonia fortress with siege ramps and towers, quite cunningly, Jewish sappers dug tunnels underneath the Roman siege engines and filled these tunnels with pitch as they scurried back to the surface. The rebels then set these tunnels ablaze, causing the siege engines and personnel on the surface to collapse into the fiery depths of the earth. This was a huge setback for Titus. Along with the brutality of urban combat, this tunneling disaster inflicted immense casualties on the Romans. Titus's forces could not continue at this rate. Would this campaign mark another defeat for the once touted invincible empire? Could the rebels actually pull this off? Titus reorganized his forces and opted for a long siege. If he couldn't fight them into submission, he starved them. Roman soldiers routinely crucified any soldier or civilian they caught fleeing the city, which could be hundreds in a day. The weeks went by. The city's denizens and soldiers fell week by week to starvation, disease, and Roman sorties. Defensive network by network, the Romans breached, eventually reaching the temple complex. Again, the rebels laid a trap for the unsuspecting Romans, collapsing one of their defensive colonnades as the Romans tried to secure the platform. The legionaries fell into a blazing inferno. Those trying to escape jumped off the structure and broke their legs, later succumbing to their injuries or picked off by rebels. But Titus didn't hold back. He pushed his assault on the most sacred area of Judaism, the Temple Mount. This fortified peak within the city was the backbone of Jerusalem's resistance. Securing this area would spell doom for the Judean combatants and the rebellion as a whole. The brutality of the fighting increased as the Zealots fought tooth and nail to stop the Romans from desecrating their holiest site. In the midst of combat, a Roman soldier threw a torch into the temple itself, setting fire to the 500-year-old sanctuary. According to Josephus, Titus had commanded that the temple was not to be damaged. Of course, Josephus could be biased, not wanting to paint his patron in a compromising light. Nonetheless, on the 9th day of Av, or the 10th of August, the temple was burned, looted, and destroyed. Many of the holy artifacts and treasures, like the menorah, the golden trumpets, and the table of the showbread, were to be carted off to Rome as spoils of war. Amidst the mass conflagration, Roman soldiers vented their incendiary frustration on the populace, resulting in mass killings and enslavements. No quarter was given. The buildings blazed with fire, while the streets ran with blood. Josephus hauntingly records in the battle's aftermath that, since his soldiers were already quite tired with killing men, and yet there appeared to be a vast multitude still remaining alive, Caesar gave orders that they should kill none but those that were in arms and oppose them, but should take the rest alive. But together with those whom they had orders to slay, they slew the aged and the infirm. But for those that were in their flourishing age and who might be useful to them, they drove them together into the temple and shut them up within the walls of the court of the women, over which Caesar set one of his freedmen, as also Fronto, one of his own friends, which last was to determine everyone's fate according to his merits. So this Fronto slew all those that had been seditious and robbers, who were impeached by one another. But of the young men he chose out the tallest and most beautiful, and reserved them for the triumph. And as for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds, and sent them to the Egyptian mines. Titus also sent a number into the provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters by the sword and by the wild beasts. But those who were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. The empire had finally recaptured the city, at a high cost of Roman lives and an immeasurable amount of Jewish ones. Josephus and Tacitus claim that up to 1 million Jews died in the war and its aftermath, along with another 100,000 enslaved. Scholars believe these numbers to be exaggerated, since they calculate that the whole population of Judea was probably around that number. Nonetheless, the totality and mass loss of life is undisputed. To add insult to injury, Titus offered pagan sacrifices on the Temple Mount, including pigs to the gods of Rome. The general then deliberately set ablaze certain areas of the city and ordered the complete destruction of Jerusalem's walls, so it could never be defended in such a manner again. The flames seemed never-ending and unquenchable. Jerusalem had become a firestorm. In the year 71, the Senate granted Titus a military triumph for his victory over the Judeans. Titus paraded 700 Jewish captives through the broad avenues of Rome and showcased the sacred temple objects that only the Jewish high priests were allowed to see. Concerning the rebel leadership, he had Simon ben Jarrah scourged and strangled, and condemned John of Giscala to life imprisonment. However, the flame of rebellion was not fully extinguished. Fanatics, zealots, and Sicarii were still held up in remote desert locations, such as Herodium, Machaerus, and famously Masada. One by one, these strongholds fell, but Masada proved to be a harder nut to crack because of its altitude. However, by the year 73, the Romans had built a high earthen ramp and mighty siege tower to reach the fortress. Surprisingly, when the assailants breached the walls, they found their enemies already dead. Josephus says that the zealots committed mass suicide before the Romans could get their hands on them. The war was finally over. The Flavians' brutal restoration of Judea as a province of the Roman Empire not only prevented other provinces from rebelling, but also brought this new dynasty legitimacy in the eyes of the Roman people, showing that the Flavians were competent at holding the reins of power, and that this new dynasty was here to stay. The destruction of the Second Temple, a central religious and cultural institution, was a particularly traumatic event in the history of Judaism, and contributed to the scattering of the Jewish people for almost 2 millennia. Many Jews fled to various parts of the Roman world and beyond, establishing communities in Asia, Africa, and Europe. The Jewish diaspora, already present since the Babylonian exile and greatly multiplied due to the war with Rome, became a defining aspect of Jewish history. With the temple gone, Rabbinic Judaism became the normative form of the religion up to our contemporary times. Yet many still remained in Judea, with the exception of Jerusalem, since Titus prohibited Jews from entering the ruined city. But as shocking as this statement may seem, this devastation was only a pale shadow of the suffering to come. For Judea would have to endure another rebellion, far more destructive than this one, only a half-century later. But that's for another time. Like, comment, share, subscribe. See you next time.
O God, the nations have invaded your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They have reduced Jerusalem to rubble. They have left the dead bodies of your servants as food for the birds of the sky, the flesh of your own people for the animals of the wild. They have poured out blood like water all around Jerusalem, and there is no one to bury the dead. We are objects of contempt to our neighbors, of scorn and derision to those around us. Before our eyes, make known among the nations that you avenge the outpoured blood of your servants.